Welcome to Count Me In. I'm your host, Adam Larson, and today we're bringing you a truly thought provoking conversation with three outstanding guests: Douglas Boyle, Daniel Haggerty, and Dana Hermanson. All three are respected professors and authors of the Curt Verschoor Feature of the Year, Aristotle and Accounting: Building Virtue to Fight Fraud. In this episode, we dig deep into the concept of virtue, what it really means, where it comes from, and why it matters for professionals in business today. From the philosophical roots of arte in the ancient Greek to practical steps for building virtuous organizations in the modern workplace, our guests explore how excellence, courage, and human flourishing can become the foundation for ethical decision-making and leadership. You'll hear why virtue often goes missing in business education and professional development, and what we can do about it. Whether you're a student, a working professional, or a leader looking to create a more ethical and effective culture, this episode offers practical insights you can put into action right away. Let's get started. Well, Daniel, Dana, and Doug, I'm so excited to have you on. We're going to be talking about your award-winning article that's out. Please look at the link in the description if you want to read that article before you listen to this conversation. But I figured we could start in a place where you can give us a bit of a background on the ongoing issue of fraud, especially in accounting and finance.
Sure. So fraud remains a major societal issue, and it's fundamentally a people issue. You know, the number one cause of fraud, as my co-author David Wolf always says, is people. So as long as you've got people in any system, you're going to see somebody do something crazy. And the cost of this issue remains high. ACFE estimates it's about 5% of revenues for the typical organization. So you extrapolate that out globally, and it's a multi-trillion-dollar problem. We've got some unique things going on in the fraud area right now. One is the continuing arms race between the perpetrators and the fraud prevention folks. For example, AI, I think, has great potential for mitigating fraud, detecting fraud, but AI is also a very useful tool for committing fraud with, fake voice, fake video, fake documents. From an accounting fraud perspective, we continue to deal with the fundamental issue that we get the financial statements from management, who knows the most about the company, but management is then in the ability, has the ability, if they want to exploit their information advantage over others. So that's why we have auditors and all the other controls in place. So we've got an issue that has attracted attention for decades. I think we have made some progress in addressing the fraud issue, but it's still a significant societal issue because people are at the heart of the issue.
So your article specifically focused on virtue. And so I figure we could start off by defining virtue, especially in the context of business and ethics, professional conduct, because it's a word that is not often used in a business context.
So to understand what we mean by virtue and how we use it in the article, I think it's really important to sort of get to the philosophical roots of this word that gets translated from Greek into Latin into English as virtue. So the original Greek word was arete, and arete referred to the qualities of excellence in warfare, right? The word arete derives from the Greek god Ares, the god of war. So the original meaning of this, arete that gets rendered ultimately into English as virtue was in no way a soft quality. It was referring to the kind of courage and even ferocity and strength that was necessary for an effective soldier in battle. But in the hands of the philosophers, and particularly Plato and Aristotle, they broadened the concept. They said, okay, well, understanding what it means to be an excellent soldier is important, but we want to try to understand more broadly, what does it mean to be an excellent human being, right? So what are the aretic qualities? That is, what are the excellences that make a person an excellent person? And such as to live an excellent life. And that was the beginning of ancient Greek ethics. Ancient Greek ethics with Plato and Aristotle, it's not about admonishing us about what we ought not to do or goading us about what we should do. It's not even really so much about right and wrong. It's about greatness. It's about excellence. Like, what sort of qualities does a human being need to possess in order to flourish in life, in order to achieve, the Greek word is eudaimonia, which is often translated as happiness. And again, I think the word happiness is kind of, vague. Maybe it's something like flourishing. What are the qualities that a human being needs to cultivate and to practice in order to flourish in life, in order to live well, in order to be happy? So that's how they broaden the concept, arete. What are these qualities? Now, when the Roman philosophers translated the Greek into Latin, they translated arete into virtus, virtus, virtus. And if you think about it, the root of the word vir, or the root there, vir, is also the root of the word virility, which suggests or means, strength, courage, energy. It also specifically meant the sort of qualities of a mature man or manliness. And, here inevitably we come up against certain attitudes toward women and men in the ancient world that we wouldn't endorse today. The idea that being fully excellent for the Greek and some of the Greek and Roman philosophers especially meant what are those qualities of an excellent man. But there is an exception, and I think it's really great to point it out, and that was Plato, right? So Plato argued that no, Plato had a view that in the ancient world was really uncommon, to say the least. And that was, Plato said, there is no reason why, in principle, a woman should not run the city, why a woman should not rule. And, even Aristotle thought that was impossible, really. He thought practically it was impossible. But Plato argued, no, what we need among our leaders are excellent people. And excellent people aren't defined by their sex or their gender or any other contingencies of their lives and circumstances. Excellent people, he said, first of all, they're very rare. And secondly, they've cultivated those virtues, even the virtues that are stereotypical of women or more characteristic of women and characteristic of men. They have the full array of virtues so that they can be fierce when fierceness is required. They're courageous, like men and women are both courageous. They can be nurturing when nurturing is required. And I think Plato was right? That what we need in leaders are those people who have most fully developed the fullest array of human excellences. So we have this word virtus, and naturally it gets translated from Latin into English as virtue. But I don't love it because I do think that, outside of philosophy, in ordinary language, when people hear virtue, it sounds like, I don't know, some sort of maybe amorphous or a soft set of qualities that is so far removed from the philosophical meaning of it, which is strength, which is courage, which is excellence. But we're retaining the word. I mean, in some cases, I think it might make sense to refer to something like aretic leadership, in part because the word is unfamiliar. So people have to think, if I say virtuous leadership, a lot of people are going to be like, well, what are you talking about, virtuous leadership? That doesn't sound like anything that really is going to be useful in the field of accounting. But if we say aretic leadership, well, they don't know what that means, first of all. So, it's an invitation to further questioning. What do you mean by aretic leadership? Well, we do mean leadership that has cultivated, practiced, is implementing those excellences or virtues that make for an effective organization and an effective leader. So I guess also I would say that for business ethics, like when Doug invited me to participate in the PhD program in accounting, originally, he just invited me to come in and give a talk. He knows I'm a philosophy professor. He wanted to develop more ethics in the program. So he invited me. And I thought, well, I'm not just going to talk about business ethics generally or abstractly. I want to really think about the problem of fraud and what philosophical ethics might be able to contribute to try to help mitigate the fraud. I'm not unrealistic. I'm not thinking that if we understand virtue, fraud's going to go away. But I do think instead of talking about utilitarianism or deontology or these abstract moral theories, and then maybe trying to apply rules to particular cases, let's instead try to deepen our understanding of the motivation to commit fraud and moral motivation more generally, and how that fits into, because virtues aren't just something like, oh, I'm going to be virtuous. I decide I'm going to be virtuous and now I'm virtuous. No, first it takes understanding and having models to understand what these qualities like courage are. And then it takes cultivation, which often takes mentoring, and it takes practice. It has to be reinforced. So I thought that, to understand moral motivation, including the motivation to commit fraud, and contrary to that, the motivation to achieve a greater level of excellence would be both a unique and, I thought, promising way to try to come at the problem of fraud from another angle.
It really struck me as we got into this discussion how what I liked so much about what Dan brought to the table was this notion of getting above the level of, don't do the crime if you can't do the time. This punishment kind of mantra. I actually had a student in class describe it one time as the importance of discipline, because there are situations that people can exploit, and it takes discipline not to do it. And I think virtue is a greatly expanded way of thinking about that. Is that I'm not doing it because I don't want to get caught and punished. I'm doing it because I want to live an excellent life, which is a very, very different approach to this whole notion of fraud prevention.
Why do you think that these concepts have been lost, especially in modern business language? It's not something like you see the self-help books, all the business books on the shelf. They're not talking about, hey, be a virtuous person.
Yeah, I mean, I came from industry before my life in academia, so I've seen this a lot in practice and then also in research. But to be simple about it, it's not how executives are trained. It's not how they do their ongoing professional development. And it's not how they're incented. So if you think about it, these leaders, and they are leaders, they get their formal education through business school. And that's particularly focused on technical topics, net present value, how we do different things. It's very quantitative. It's very analytical. And now it's very technology focused with AI and everything coming up. So it's not how they're initially trained when they're young through their education. And it's not how they continue to get their CPE credits, particularly in accounting and finance. There's many certifications, and they require ethics training, but that typically focuses on rules. Like, you can't do this, you can't do that, don't let your client buy you lunch. Lots of things that are very important to understand, but it's not building virtue. It's a rule book. It's a kind of a don't do this, don't do that. And that's not how virtue is understood or built. So, what we're trying to do here is give these executives an alternative way to think about ethics, and not just be so rules-based, but also be more human behavioral based. And that ties into incentives, because executives, in particular CFOs, which a lot of the folks in the IMA are CFOs or controllers, they're typically incented to meet short-term financial objectives. So to build virtue takes time, and it's work, and it's practice, and you ultimately will get there. And research has shown that organizations who build trust with their employees, it leads to higher levels of employee satisfaction, which leads to higher levels of customer satisfaction, which ultimately lead to better financial outcomes. So this pursuit of virtue is not just a nice thing to do. It also has a real financial impact to a company, but it takes time. So I'm not going to build virtue with myself and my leadership team and the culture of my organization in one quarter to impact next quarter's results. It's going to take a little time, and that's not how executives are typically compensated. So those are kind of the challenges we have in business to overcome to really change the ethical framework. Because until we start building virtue and looking at the human side, the behavioral side, controls are really important and rules are really important, but they're limiting. So that's why I think it hasn't really taken off in business. It has to do with education, ongoing development, and also incentives. So that's kind of the path that we're trying to plow here is to make people aware of this. And we've also talked about maybe having some CPE courses and ethics that are more geared this way. Because what we found in our PhD program and also in our MAC program, and I know Dana has seen this at Kennesaw as well, is people love this. Like, students love it, executives love it. They want to hear more about it because everybody wants to live an excellent life, right? So there's a lot of interest out there. So that makes it very promising for folks like us who develop these articles and develop these programs, is that there is a real interest in this. So we really do think there could be impact here.
Yeah, I could add to that if you give me a moment here. And that's so, some going back to what Doug said at the beginning about at the level of education, undergraduate education. So it's not uncommon, I think, for business students generally, maybe accounting students in particular, to take a course or even be required to take a course in ethics. In our institution, and I think in many institutions, business ethics is offered out of the philosophy department, right? So, but I, I mean, of course, I'm sure there are exceptions, but generally, the philosophical approach to ethics, generally, and business ethics in particular, is very theoretical and abstract. And this might be hard to imagine, but the philosophical question about theoretical ethics is what makes right actions right and wrong actions wrong? What is the nature of good? What is the nature of bad? These are very, I think, interesting, right? I'm a philosophy professor, but again, very abstract theoretical questions. Some of the theories of morality that have been developed, over millennia in Western philosophy are efforts to answer those abstract questions. Aristotle weighed in on that. Plato weighed in on that. But Aristotle said, and I agree with this, he said, well, it's one thing to try to answer theoretically what is the nature of the good and what makes right actions right. But when it comes to actually living well or even doing the right thing, a philosophical theory is not going to be helpful. It's not like, well, we should consult the theory, and the theory is going to give us a decision procedure to decide what to do in this particular situation, because Aristotle recognizes that the circumstances are so various that we can't answer abstractly what's the right thing to do in that particular situation. It depends on that situation. So what Aristotle said, what is needed is not a set of rules or a theory. What is needed is the cultivation of virtuous people. Virtuous people can count on themselves and can be counted on to do the best they can in a given situation. There's no absolute guarantee that they won't make a mistake or that it couldn't have been better. But what we need are not rules or theories to apply rules. What we need is the cultivation of a certain kind of person to do well and to live well. And I suspect that philosophical ethics and business ethics is not taught that way, or even if it is taught that way, it's just a description of, the virtue approach to ethics. What we're trying to do here is actually begin the cultivation and the recognition and cultivation and practice of virtue. So Doug and I have been in very recent conversation about developing a concentration in ethics for accounting and finance. So not just business ethics, but ethics for accounting and finance. And that would be a 5-course sequence over 4 years of undergraduate study, culminating in a capstone course where virtue and ethics would be included in some of the required accounting courses. And then it would culminate in a capstone course offered out of the philosophy department, understanding that now you're about to embark on this career. What have you learned? How can you continue to develop it? How can you apply it? Why is it important? So I think that's sort of like at the beginning in undergraduate education, that sort of approach, again, it's not just theoretical and abstract, it's formative, is really valuable.
The way I introduce this, I teach an undergraduate fraud and forensic course. And the first day of class, I talk about the nature of accounting education up to the point of taking this course. I say to them, you've been learning how to do the calculations, what the underlying concepts are. You are coming up with answers, but other than the answer being correct, nobody cared what the answer was. What we're going to address in this course is now you're out there in the field, you're coming up with an answer, and now somebody comes and says, I don't like the answer, because with that answer, I don't get my bonus. With that answer, I miss my target. So what we're going to focus on here is all of these pressures that come from all sides that want to influence your creation of this information. And ultimately, what we're going to talk about is how are you going to respond to that? How are you going to deal with those kinds of issues? And it is a totally different setting than learning how to calculate some type of depreciation. It's, well, can we do something with salvage values? Can we do something with useful life? Because I don't like the answer you're giving me. It's going to be damaging to the company. So it's a totally different way of thinking about the accounting world that's just, I think, valuable and very rewarding to expose the students to.
So I think that's great, to incorporate that into our students coming up in the next generation of accountants. But maybe we can shift the conversation a little bit and talk a little bit about for folks who are in industry right now, and maybe their team, they're like, okay, I want to build virtue, but I also need to meet my numbers. How do I bridge that gap? And maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Sure. So I think it's critical to build understanding of, what is virtue? What are the key virtues that Aristotle emphasized? We've got a number of resources in the article for building in these concepts with different resources in different areas of the company, hiring and mentoring, top management, leadership. So I encourage people to take a look at the article for some specific exercises and resources. And while I think that the training is a critical first step, and that needs to be ongoing training, two other things that really come through is that you can't have training that emphasizes virtues and then people look at how management behaves and how the organization is really run, And if they perceive a disconnect there, what they're going to focus on is how management behaves and how the organization is really run. And then it becomes, okay, we did virtue training to check a box. And now I see that the people who get ahead in the organization don't look that virtuous to me. The behaviors that get me rewarded either financially or through advancement through the organization don't appear to be reflecting any type of virtue. So you gotta solve the disconnect if there is one. And that, like so many initiatives, it's gotta the focus on virtue starts with training, it starts with education, it starts with reinforcement, but it also takes consistency with the actual ethical tone in the company, and that you've got to have top leadership that is driving this. Without that, it falls apart.
If I could say a little more about that, often when people think of ethics, they think of actions. What can you do? What can't you do? But virtue, as Aristotle understood it, action sort of comes at the end of the line. Focuses on is the development and the cultivation of habits of thinking, of feeling, of emotion, of desire, and all of those lead to action. So Dana's absolutely right. Those habits of thought and feeling and desire and emotion are occur in a culture, they occur in a context, and they're either reinforced by that culture or there's a disconnection there. So the cultivation and the practice of virtue isn't something that can be done just individually, like, oh, I'm going to be virtuous now, I'm going to learn how to think. No, it's about reinforcing these attitudes, these habits of thought about the profession, thought about those the profession serves, thought about the honor of the profession, what we desire, what we want, our emotional responses to stress and to challenges. And that has to be reinforced, I think, beginning with education at the undergraduate level and then all the way through.
I think that rings real true with our profession too, because we're one of the only professions where we have an obligation to the public. So think about that for a second. I mean, we obviously have an obligation to our employer and things like that, but our ultimate obligation as professionals is to the public. So that lends itself really to virtues, because we need to understand that and we need to behave that way in how we come up with decisions and think about things. So I think particularly in accounting, we're probably one of the only professions, or very few professions, who have that broader obligation. I think the downside, you can mitigate some of that downside hit, because, like, if we trust Adam's judgment, and we know we might not understand exactly why Adam made the decision he did, but we know he's an excellent person and we trust his judgment, you can mitigate some of that downside. But that takes time, like Dana said, to build that kind of reputation, because people will trust the decisions you're making are consistent with the facts, all the facts you had, and you exercise really good judgment. So we need to trust a little bit more with Adam, but that takes time to build.
Well, people have been burned so many times that it's hard to build back up that trust, because, they've had leaders ahead of them who've told them to do things and they're like, I can't trust this person. Or somebody's making a crazy decision and they're like, well, last time somebody made that decision, my company tanked and I lost everything, So, are there tips or thoughts about, how do you build, like, what are steps you can take to kind of build up that trust that's required to have that, that virtuous organization?
One thing Dan talked about is information gathering. So not everybody might not agree with the ultimate decision, but if they feel that their views on the decision were heard and they were seriously considered, I think that's an important first step. And that requires time, right? And that requires a skill set. But I think too often in business, decisions are made by a small group of individuals, and a lot of other stakeholders felt that their interests weren't heard. So I think, gathering that information in a very appropriate way is important.
I think if there isn't that kind of information made available, it's very easy for people to fall into sort of coming up with what somebody else's motivation must have been. Our university president here emphasizes that all the time. Don't think you understand somebody's motivation. As soon as you start ascribing motivation, you get onto thin ice. So I think that transparency about voices were heard. These are the things we considered. This is why we ended up, and may or may not be a short-term hit, but we're looking for long-term benefit. It's critical.
I would add that trust requires a relationship. And that goes back to our discussion of culture. And I am reminded of this line in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, that he's speaking of a certain kind of relationship, friendship. We're not talking about friendship in this podcast, but I think it applies nonetheless. And he said, people cannot truly be friends until and unless they have shared much salt. And then he doesn't explain, he doesn't elaborate, which is good because it's an invitation for us to think. And, one thing that comes to mind is they've actually shared meals together, of course, which is a way of building up relationship and community, right? Overcoming this sense of everybody's for themselves, they're not connected to one another. But what else do we think of when we think of sharing much salt? Well, sweat, right? Where they've worked together, right? They've collaborated together in a joint effort, and they've applied themselves, right? They've sweated together. You think of tears with salt, so you think of hardship, you think of hard times, you think of enduring them together in relationship, in community. Salt, you think of blood, you think of pain, you think of injury. So it's not like, trust it's a deep thing. It's a precious thing that has to be cultivated, it has to be sought, it has to be understood, it has to be desired, and it has to be reinforced. It has to be honored. So, in addition to the sort of practical answers to what it takes to cultivate that trust, I think that broader sort of philosophical understanding is also a nice way to frame it.
Also, salt brings out the best in things. Like when you
The
put salt
flavor.
on food, it brings out all the other flavors.
That's right.
So if we
That's
have
right.
salt among each other, we're bringing out the best in each other, which in case of friendship and in leadership, we want to bring out the best in our employees. If we're a friend, you want to bring out the best in your friend. So I think that's another way of looking at the salt reference.
Have you been reading Aristotle?
Not since my undergraduate one philosophy
very
class I had
good.
to take.
That's very good. Yeah.
So, we could go on this conversation for a long time and go around the circle a number of ways, but I figure we could kind of wrap up our conversation. But maybe saying you could maybe give a piece of advice you'd give to maybe a young professional, somebody entering the finance and accounting field, which, you guys are all professors, so you see those young minds a lot. If you wanted to give them one piece of advice about the importance of virtue, what would that be?
Yeah, I would start by saying you're going to have a very long career. And you're going to most certainly run into ethical dilemmas, and you're also going to be subject to pressure to maybe not make the right decision. So if the more you understand that early on, and you take a more long-term perspective that you are going to live by a set of virtues, you will stand out, and you will reach very high levels of an organization. And sometimes you might have to change your organization if they don't have the same ethical framework. But your career is a long-term marathon. And a lot of young people, you want to get promoted next week, and they might take shortcuts or succumb to pressure. Sometimes it's best to maybe leave an opportunity to pursue another one. So having that long-term view ultimately will result in a very sustainable career where you will reach the upper echelons at the right place. But you have to have a little patience to do that. And you have to have a little confidence in yourself. Like Dan was saying before, courage is a really important virtue, and you need to have courage throughout your career. So there's no shortcuts.
My advice also builds on what Dan said earlier, the fundamental importance of courage. And what I really try to convey to our students, what I try to convey to people in the profession is have the courage to question, have the courage to challenge, have the courage to think, I'm not an idiot and this doesn't make sense to me. Somebody's got some other motivation here. I need to understand that. Have the courage to ask for time to consider what you're going to do. Don't make snap decisions. And then ultimately have the courage to report something or change employers if needed. But it's about taking control of your career with this long-term horizon that as I go through this thing, I'm going to do things the right way. And there may be some short-term hits. Yeah, I may run into a boss who says, you're not getting promoted because you weren't willing to play. Okay, I'll find a place that values that. But I think for me, so much comes back to courage. I think that's just absolutely foundational.
I agree. So Aristotle understood that the excellences range from public life to private life, right? That there are excellences in relationships, in friendships, in family. There are excellences in the local community. There are excellences of citizenship, political, military, business, that there's an array of excellences because human life is complex. And I guess the philosopher's answer to advice to a student, but I would encourage an accounting student, and I have one. I mean, one of my daughters is currently studying accounting as an undergraduate, and that is to, of course, we talk about work-life balance, and I understand the importance of that, but not to take that to mean that you should see your work and career as disconnected from the rest of your life, right? The idea of virtue is to flourish and to live excellently across life, right? In all areas of your life. And so I would encourage students going into the field of accounting to really look at their vocation, to look at their career as honorable and as an opportunity to live honorably professionally, as well as living honorably personally, right? I think what I mean by living honorably is ultimately, I think, living in such a way that you could admire it, living in such a way that you knew you did well. You didn't do perfectly, and you kept at it, you kept developing, and you aspired not just to be good, but in your own way to be great.
Well, Dan, Dana, and Doug, thank you all so much for coming on the podcast. It was really great speaking with you and discussing this virtue, especially in the business sense. And I think it's been a really enlightening conversation.
Great. Well, thank you very much.
This has been Count Me In, IMA's podcast, providing you with the latest perspectives of thought leaders from the accounting and finance profession. If you like what you heard and you'd like to be counted in for more relevant accounting and finance education, visit IMA's website at www.imanet.org.